Hi, my name is Jim Merhelt, and I'm here to talk to you today about the mindset and the idea of switching from a judger or a judgmental mindset to a learner mindset. So let's get into it. I'd like to begin with an experience of how mindsets switch. So I'm going to put a photo on the screen, and I'd just like you to just take a quick look at the photo. I'm only going to leave it up there for a second, and pay attention to your reaction to the photo, especially the thoughts that jump into your head when you see it. Okay, so that was it. So again, pay attention to the thoughts that jumped into your head. And the first thoughts that jump into our head when we see a photo like that, which is a difficult photo to look at, are usually thoughts of fear or anxiety, um, and it puts us into what we will learn later. It puts us into a judger's mindset. Now, I'm going to put the photo up there again. I'm going to ask you to look at it for a little bit longer and just reflect on it a little bit. So the longer I leave it up there, the more you have time to explore it. And the initial emotional charge of the photo can sort of fade away. You can relax, you can take a breath, and you can look at it more deeply. And you may even notice there on the roof on the left side, you can see the word opportunity. And as you're looking at the photo and you see that word, it may cause a question to well up in you, something like, so what is the opportunity in this photo? And as soon as you start asking questions like that, you have already shifted from the judger's or the judgmental mindset to the learner's mindset. What kinds of opportunities are present here? So you're not only seeing the tragedy, you're not only seeing the despair, you're starting to see hope, even in the midst of a very difficult situation. So that's the experience of switching from a judger's mindset to a learner's mindset. This presentation will be based on the work of two women. The first is Carol Dweck. She's a psychologist at Stanford University, and she wrote this book, Mindset, back in right around 2006. It's Mindset, the New Psychology of Success. And then the second book is by Marilee Adams. She's the director of the Inquiry Institute. And this book, Change Your Questions, Change Your Life, is also on mindset and came out in about 2015. They approach this topic from very different points of view. Carol Dweck from the psychological point of view. And when she talks about mindset, she usually talks about them using the words the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset. And when Marilee talks about mindset, she's coming at it from more of organizational development and leadership perspective. And so she talks about the judger mindset and the learner mindset. So we will primarily use Marilee's work for this presentation, but it's also influenced heavily by the work of Carol Dweck. So now let's take a look at this. This is out of Marilee's book, Change Your Questions, Change Your Life. She calls it the choice map. And notice she says we choose moment by moment. So these things happen very quickly in our lives. Mindset shifting can happen in a second. It's not like a long drawn out process. So here is how this works. Note the starting point on the left side. And that's the moment that something happens to you that has an impact on you. And we're going to say that something that happens is some kind of a challenge. Okay? So, for example, your spouse approaches you and says something that makes you a little bit upset, or somebody at work does something and it bothers you, or you're working on a team with a team of people and something happens on the team and you're not comfortable with it. Okay? So that's the starting point. You're facing some kind of interpersonal challenge. Typically, what happens in that moment is that we begin to move down the judger's path with judger mindset. And note the questions that are in the bubbles on the judger path. All right, whose fault is this? Or you could turn judger in on yourself. And you could say, so what's wrong with me anyway? Why don't I get this? Why do I keep making these mistakes, right? That's turning judger in on yourself. Or you can turn judger out on other people and be judgmental against them. What's wrong with them? Why don't they get it? Or you could get into the judger pit where things really get stuck. Why am I such a failure? Why are they so stupid? Why bother with this anyway? Think about those questions. Think about how they make you feel. Think about what they do to your ability to act. That's the judger mindset and the impact that it has on us. Now let's take a look at the learner mindset and the questions that are associated with the learner mindset. Notice the first question there in that first bubble on the left. What happened? So you get reflective. What really happened here? Or what is actually happening here? Second question, what do I want? What do I really want, both for myself and for others? What can I learn? Notice how that shifts you immediately into possibility. And then there's the questions about assumptions and facts. Assumptions, of course, are things that we believe to be true, although we don't have hard evidence for it. Facts are things that we believe to be true and we have evidence for it. And so in learner thinking, we're always trying to distinguish between our assumptions and the facts. What am I assuming? What do I know to be true here? In learner thinking, we're also in a disposition of empathy. In other words, we try to see things and experience things from the point of view of the other person. So what is it that they are actually thinking? What are they feeling? What does this person want? And then we also talk about responsibility rather than blame, right? So it's not, is it my fault? Is it their fault? The question is, okay, so am I being responsible? And what actually is my responsibility here? And what is the responsibility of the other people who are involved or the other person? And then the final bubble, what's possible? Very hopeful question. What are my choices? Notice it's not, do I have any choices? I always have choices. What are my choices? And then what's best to do now? What is my next step going to be? So the learner is characterized by thoughtful choices. It's solution focused. It's looking for a positive experience on both sides of the issue. So there's more to this choice map. Look at the images. Look at the judger characters. Notice that they're not moving. They're just standing still. And then eventually they are completely stuck in the judger pit. And then notice the learner characters on the move. Other things that you could notice, like the trajectory of the judger mindset versus the learner. Notice the judger mindset is going downhill. So you could see that in two ways. It's downhill, downward spiral to the judger pit, which is a good way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that it's the downhill path. It's the easier one. And that is true. We tend to go to our judger first because it's easier and because it's naturally automatic. And I'll explain that later. Whereas the learner mindset is uphill. If you're going to be in learner mindset, you're going to have to work for it. It's not your default mindset. We are all recovering judgers. We all naturally go judger first before we switch, and notice the switching lane, before we switch to learner. And yes, I believe there's always hope. Even if you're in the judger pit, you can still make your way to the switching lane. This image doesn't show that clearly, but it's true. I love also how on the far upper right, not only the mountain and the sunshine, but notice how the pathway just bleeds off into the white on the right side. In other words, there is no end. When you're on the learner's path, the possibilities truly are endless. So let's take a look for a minute at some of the brain science behind these mindsets. So the judger mindset, you could call it hot thinking, and the photo there of the guy gives you a sense of why we call it hot thinking. The judger mindset's home is the amygdala. And then on the right side, you see cool thinking, and the woman there on the lower right gives you a sense of what cool thinking looks like. And so the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that's lit up there in the image, that is the home of the learner's mindset. So let's talk for a bit about the different functions of the amygdala versus the prefrontal cortex. And you'll get a sense of how the brain functions in judger and how it functions in learner. So the amygdala, the home of judger mindset, it is the brain's fear center. It senses fear and moves into action. It's the brain's gut response center. So it's not reflective, it's very automatic. It sees the world as good and bad, black and white, right and wrong, win and lose. There are no gray areas for the amygdala. Everything is crystal clear. The amygdala is designed to manage the systems in your body that will protect you when you are under a physical threat or you are being physically attacked. That's what the amygdala is designed to do. It's designed to protect you. Okay? So it's not judger bad, right? It's just a question of how you want to use your judger. The amygdala operates at lightning speed. So when you're under physical threat or physical attack, there's no time to ponder and reflect. All of your responses have to be at lightning speed. Interestingly, also, this part of your brain is the oldest part of your brain. And I mean that both in terms of human evolution and in terms of human development. So for example, in human evolution, as we evolved as a species, this part of our brain developed first before that outer part of our brain developed. So we had amygdala functioning, again, as a way to protect us in a dangerous environment. We needed that first before we could become a more reflective species. But also in terms of human development across the span of one human lifetime. When a baby is born, it has a fully functioning amygdala, but its outer brain is underdeveloped, not completely developed. And that's why babies can survive. Their amygdala causes them to go into reactions when something's wrong that signals danger to other people, and that's how they communicate what they need to survive. Very high functioning amygdala in a baby. But they don't have those reflective processes yet that are more appropriate for the outer brain. Those outer brain parts don't fully develop until a person is in their mid-20s. So from childhood to adolescence, that outer brain is still developing, and we wonder why adolescents do things that don't make sense to us as adults. Why aren't they thinking about the long-term consequences? Well, long-term consequence thinking is prefrontal cortex thinking. And so when teenagers do things, and you're wondering, why aren't they thinking about what's going to happen down the road if they do that? It's because they don't have full capacity to think that way. We're asking them to do something that they're not yet ready fully to do. And so we have to help them do that. We have to create the structures for them to do that until they are in their mid-20s when that part of their brain is fully developed. I have a lot of fun with this with my kids as they move through adolescence and into a young adulthood. Okay, so that's the amygdala on the left side. Now let's take a look at the prefrontal cortex on the right side, home of the learner's mindset. It's called the brain's executive center. It does all of the high-level thinking and planning. It can analyze a person's behavior today and imagine the consequences of that behavior a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, several years from now. It can imagine what's going to happen if I do this today, what's going to happen then, even decades. People who are really good at retirement planning have very strongly developed prefrontal cortex, right? Because the amygdala doesn't do that kind of thinking. You have to do that kind of thinking in your outer brain. If I do this today, what is my retirement going to look like? Teen pregnancies, another example, right? They don't think 9 months down the road because they don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. So if a 16-year-old is having sex, they're not imagining that that's going to turn into a baby 9 months down the road. Whereas adults have the capacity to think that way. The prefrontal cortex can also balance and analyze a wide array of data, even conflicting data, and find patterns and make meaning in the midst of all of that. The prefrontal cortex operates very slowly, and it requires lots of time to formulate its ideas and to draw its conclusions. It also requires a high level of blood flow in the brain in order for it to work and function properly. It is the youngest part of the brain, both in terms of human evolution and in terms of human development. So again, it was the last part of our brain to develop as a species, and in the course of one human lifetime, it's the last part of the brain to develop when you're hitting your mid-20s. I'd like to describe for you what happens when a person feels threatened and goes into judger because their amygdala begins to function significantly. And so to help you understand this, I want you to imagine that you're standing in a field and there is an angry wolf charging at you. Okay, so that's the perfect situation for the amygdala to go into overdrive. And here are some of the things that happen physiologically. And we're going to go through these because if you can work these physiological symptoms, you can make the switch from judger mindset to learner mindset. But you have to understand the physiology in order to make the switch effectively. So blood flow changes when your amygdala kicks into high gear. The blood drains from your brain and it focuses the circulation on your extremities. So you get more blood and oxygen to your arms and your legs. Because if you're going to run away from the wolf, or if you're going to fight the wolf, you're going to need lots of oxygen in the extremities of your body to sustain that. Your vision actually changes. It becomes more tunnel vision. You lose some of your peripheral vision when your amygdala is in high gear. Because if you're going to be fighting a wolf, you don't need to see so much what's around you. You need to see clearly what's right in front of you and every move that that beast is making. So you lose peripheral vision so as to sharpen your direct focus. You also lose access to your prefrontal cortex. So as the blood flow drains, your prefrontal cortex doesn't have enough oxygen to function. And so it's almost like a door shuts. Your amygdala shuts a door and you no longer have access to your prefrontal cortex in these situations. And you don't want to have access to your prefrontal cortex. The last thing you want to do in a situation where a wolf is charging you is go into analytical mode or long-range planning mode. You may only have minutes left. Your retirement doesn't matter at this point. As the wolf's charging, you're not going to pull out an iPad and start calculating the distance of the wolf and the velocity and acceleration of the wolf. No, you're going to be in survival mode. So you don't need your prefrontal cortex at this moment. Another thing that happens is that your adrenal gland releases stress hormones into your system, the stress hormones of adrenaline and cortisol, and they go into your bloodstream. And your muscles also tense up. And they tense up for the purpose of holding the adrenaline and the cortisol in your system because you need it there for the long fight. Your breathing becomes shallow and rapid. So you're not taking any deep cleansing breaths right now. You are in survival mode and you are determined to fight to the death or to run like hell. There are actually four possible responses, and they all begin with the letter F, right? And you've heard some of these before: fight, flight, freeze, or faint. That's what happens when the amygdala is in high gear. And this is the proper response to an angry wolf. So again, the amygdala, the judger mindset, has a place. Its place is to protect you when you are under physical threat. Here's the problem. When you are having a fight with your spouse, for example, and it's not a physical fight, it's just an argument, your brain is interpreting your spouse in the same way that it interprets a charging wolf. And so your brain goes into this whole physiological process that I just described when your spouse upsets you. Your blood flow changes. You lose access to your prefrontal cortex. And there is the big tragedy in spousal arguments. When we don't have access to our prefrontal cortex, we lose a sense of how our behavior is going to impact the relationship long term. We don't think about what we say and how it's going to impact this relationship long term. And so when you settle down and you get access again to your prefrontal cortex, that's when you start feeling the guilt. And you start realizing, oh, look at what I said. Now I'm going to have to deal with that for weeks and months. Now I have to rebuild trust, which takes a long time. So you start to think about the consequences of your behavior, and it makes you feel guilty. So your brain is interpreting your spouse as a charging wolf, and it goes into all of these characteristics of what we call, in this situation, an amygdala hijack. If you are in this situation where your spouse upsets you, or a coworker or a teammate upsets you, here's the thing. You don't need to be using your judger at that moment. Because again, you're not under physical attack. You don't need to have an amygdala response in that moment. There's no physical danger. What you need is your very best thinking. So when somebody upsets you, you need to get back into your prefrontal cortex so that you can de-escalate the situation and have a reasonable discussion about something that is very important in the relationship, or it wouldn't have upset you. So to get from an amygdala hijack back into learner mindset and cool prefrontal cortex thinking, you simply have to reverse the physiological process. And one of the first things you can do to reverse it is to take a deep cleansing breath. So remember, part of the amygdala hijack is that you have gone to shallow, rapid breathing. So if you change that to a deep cleansing breath, that will signal to your body that it's time to move out of your amygdala and into your prefrontal cortex. It's time to relax and have a good conversation. So the deep cleansing breath, what I'd recommend is that you take the inhale through your nose. And when you do that, your nose has all kinds of receptors in it that are not in your mouth. They're in your nose. And those receptors signal to your body that it's time to relax. That's why a deep cleansing breath through your nose is so relaxing. And then you exhale, and as you exhale, what you want to focus on the exhale is calming and relaxing those tense muscles wherever they are. Every person carries their muscle tension differently. Some it's in their jaw, some it's in their neck, some in their shoulders or in their lower back. It's really important for you to identify where you carry your muscle tension when you're upset. So the next time you get upset, pay attention to your body and do a scan and notice where is the tension. And once you know the tension, where you carry it, then when you take that deep cleansing breath, those are the muscles that you can focus on relaxing and feel them loosen up. And as soon as they loosen up, the next thing happens, which is the release of the stress hormones of adrenaline and cortisol. If your muscles are relaxed, you cannot sustain and hold those stress hormones in your system, so they will drain. And once they drain, then your blood flow changes, you get more oxygen to your brain, and you gain access again to your prefrontal cortex. And it happens in an instant. So again, deep breath, muscle relaxation, stress chemicals drain, blood flow returns to your brain, and you have access to your prefrontal cortex. And now you can have the conversation that you need to have with your spouse, one that will really get you to creative solutions for both of you. So let's say just a little bit more about befriending your judger. Because again, as we mentioned before, the judger is not bad. The judger has a place. And again, specifically to protect you when you're under physical threat. But it also has another purpose that you can take advantage of. Rather than using your judger as a trigger to set you off on an amygdala hijack where you start to yell at someone or say things you don't mean or think in terms of black and white and right and wrong and good and bad and win and lose, rather than letting your judger trigger that kind of response or that kind of reaction, you can use your judger to signal to you that it's time for a good conversation because something important just happened. Okay, so in other words, when something bothers you in a relationship that matters to you, that's a signal to you that something important is going on. What do we tend to do when something like that happens? We either tend to fight it or we tend to run away from it and pretend it's not there and we don't discuss it. So when something like that happens that bothers you, it's a signal. It's a signal that something important is happening in this relationship. Something that matters has come up and it's time for a good discussion. And so when you get that signal, that's the time to take the breath, to relax the muscles, to shift the blood flow, and to open your upper brain. So you can do your best executive thinking, your best thinking about long-term consequences, your best thinking about what do we really want in this situation. So that's how you befriend the judger. Use it as a signal, not a trigger for the wrong kinds of responses that you don't want. All right, so let's take a look at some of the characteristics of the judger mindset versus the learner mindset. This is just a nice, helpful little chart that has judger mindset characteristics on the left and learner mindset characteristics on the right, and they correspond with each other. So it's reactive and automatic, that's the judger, versus the more responsive and thoughtful learner mindset, very quick, rapid thinking to more reflective thinking. The judger mindset tends to be critical rather than appreciative, as the learner mindset is. Judger mindset is more closed-minded, right? Right, wrong, this, that, win, lose. Whereas the learner mindset is more open-minded. It can consider multiple possibilities and multiple points of view at the same time. The judger mindset is focused on having the answers. I'm the answer person. I know what's right here. Whereas the learner mindset, it values not knowing. And sometimes that's a difficult thing for people to appreciate. Values not knowing. That sounds like a bad thing. But in this instance, it's actually a good thing. If I value the idea of not knowing, then that means I'm open to learning. I'm open to your point of view because maybe there's something in your point of view that I'm missing. Maybe there's something in your point of view that can add to or complement my point of view. So I value the possibility of not knowing, and I'm open to learning. Judger mindset has one point of view only, and learner mindset, multiple perspectives. Judger mindset focuses on blame. Who's to blame here? Learner mindset focuses on what is the responsibility of all parties involved. Judger mindset is problem-focused. Learner mindset, solution-focused. Judger tends to defend assumptions, whereas the learner questions them. What am I assuming to be true that I really don't 100% know to be true? Let's test that assumption. And then the reflective or the mood of each mindset is very different. The judger's mood is protective and fearful. The learner's mood is curious, authentic curiosity. Okay, so we made reference to the switching lane. And the switching lane is very important because as you move from judger mindset to learner mindset, there is the movement which we call the switch. And let's just pay attention to that a little bit. There are certain questions that are associated with the switch from judger to learner. And everyone usually sort of has maybe one or two switching questions that work really well for them. So here's a list of possible switching questions. Am I in judger? Just realizing that you're there is often enough to remind you to take the breath, to relax, and switch to learner. Am I willing to switch? Right? Sometimes our willpower to stay in a fight is so strong that just realizing that I'm allowing that willpower to overpower my better judgment, that might be enough to get a person to take the breath and to switch. What is the other experiencing? This is one that really works well for me. When I start thinking about what's really going on in the world of the other person, that's usually what signals to me personally to make the switch. Empathy. Then where is the humor in this? Using humor can be a great tool to help a person switch from being upset to being calm and reflective. Being functional and practical is also helpful. Is this working for me? Is this working for us? I mean, if we keep having this, is this really working for us? That might be enough for a person to take the deep breath, relax, and move into a different kind of a conversation. Is the situation escalating? If I can see that things are starting to escalate and get out of hand, sometimes that will be enough to get me to say, okay, de-escalate. Breath, relax, oxygen flow. Let's talk about this differently. Is this what I want to be thinking, feeling, and doing? It's really just getting down to what do we really want here? And that might be enough to get you to start thinking about switching. How important are questions? Look at this quote. If I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on the solution, I would spend the first 55 minutes of that hour determining the proper question to ask. For if I knew the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. That's how powerful getting to the right question is. There's a story of Thomas Jefferson that's a little disturbing. When he was doing research on race relations, he was thinking about getting a group, well, he actually did get a group of scientists to research a question that he posed to them. And the question was extremely unfortunate. The question was, why are black people inferior to white people? That was the question that Thomas Jefferson posed to a group of scientists. It's the wrong question. He didn't spend enough time getting to the right question in order to send that scientific study down a productive path. So the scientists simply reinforced the thinking that black people are inferior to white people because all of their work was on proving why black people are inferior to white people. It was the wrong question. Had they come up with a better question, then simply a question like, are white people and black people equal? Then the scientists would have gone down a completely different trajectory in their research, a trajectory that would have been more helpful. Think about your life now. And go back to thinking about that situation in your life where you experience a challenge. This could be something that happened to you recently, a challenge that happened recently interpersonally, like with a spouse or a friend or a coworker or an acquaintance. So put yourself in that situation and try to hear in your head the question that surfaces the moment that you get upset. Do you blame yourself? What's wrong with me? Do you blame the other person or group? What's wrong with them? Do you go into fault-finding mode? Or is it one of these other questions? What's the judger question, the one or two that pop up for you when you find yourself in a challenging situation interpersonally? It's important to know the question, because if you know it, you'll recognize it. And recognizing it will signal to you that you're in judger. And when you know you're in judger, then you have awareness that it's time to take a breath, relax the muscles, shift the blood flow, and open your prefrontal cortex, and then have a good conversation. Next, in that same situation, what would be a helpful switching question for you? So you may know this already by thinking about times in your past when you were upset and you successfully calmed yourself down and then transitioned into a better conversation. You probably have had these experiences. And what is it that actually helps you make that switch? What is it that gets you from an argument to a productive discussion? Is it just the awareness that you're having the argument? Is it the awareness of your stubbornness that I'm going to stay in this argument, I'm not willing to switch? Or do you at some point become aware of the other person's experience? Does empathy bubble up for you? Or have you used humor to calm down situations? And so when you start to feel a temptation to go to humor, that could be your signal, it's time to take the breath. Okay, or are you pragmatic? Do you get to the sense of, this just isn't working? Or can you spot escalation? And when you spot escalation, you know that danger's on the way. Or do you sink into, what do I want? This isn't what I want. I want something else. And that could signal you to take the breath. Everybody needs one or two good switching questions that they can go to when they're in a situation where they're upset. And then imagine that same situation again and think about what would have been the good questions to ask yourself or the other person in that situation. So maybe you could have asked yourself, what do I really want here? What is my next most important step to get it? Now you're starting thinking about processes and possibilities. Or you could even ask the question out loud, what's our goal here? Or thinking about what worked for you in the past, right? What has worked for me? Or ask it out loud. Look, we've been in this situation before. What really helps us in this situation? A lot of times when my wife and I are having an issue, we'll think about, okay, how did we handle this in the past? And very often it comes down to, when we plan well, we do well. And so whenever we're in a difficult situation, we think, okay, so what's the plan here? How do we want to plan for this? And that tends to work for us. What can I learn? Go think about the assumptions again. What are the assumptions here? What are the facts here? So which of these questions would have been good for you in that situation? Think about those questions. Plan to use them in the future. Now let's take a moment to understand the dynamics of questions and results. This is a helpful little 4-letter memory tool for you, QDAR. And questions, decisions, actions, results describes for you sort of the chronology of what happens when you're using question thinking and mindset. The idea here is if you change your questions, you can change your results. Too often, when we have results that we don't like, we simply try to change our behavior, right? Change our actions. And we find that even though we're trying to change our actions, we still get the same results. Anybody who's tried to diet or get an exercise plan understands this. And if you're not getting the results you want in terms of diet or exercise, and then you try to get on a new diet or a new exercise plan without really thinking of the underlying questions that are driving your behavior and your results, you find that you fail. So if you want the results to be different, you need to change the questions. So I, for example, had this happen to me in terms of an exercise plan, actually. One time I was in a coaching session with a coach that I was working with. And I brought to the session the issue of me consistently over decades trying to get into exercise plans and failing at those plans consistently. And we talked it through, and as we were talking it through, I really began to understand that there was a core question that was at the heart of my failure to exercise consistently. And the question was, why can't smart and creative people also be fit? That was the question. Why can't smart and creative people also be fit and healthy? It's a terrible question. And so I shifted the question. how can I balance my intelligence, my creativity, and my physical fitness? Once I shifted to that question, then I began to make decisions about my thinking, my creativity, and my physical fitness plan that were more powerful. I began to see the three of them working together. And I know where the misguided belief of how smart and creative people can't be fit came from. It came from my upbringing. I grew up with five brothers, and my five brothers were all very athletic, and so was I as a young guy. And but as I got into high school, I had some injuries that prevented me from pursuing certain high school sports, the ones that were important to my family. And so I started to dig more into my studies and more into music. And I sort of fashioned myself as the smart, creative brother in my family and opposed the more athletic side of my family. And I saw them as different and incompatible. And that was the kind of thinking that led to me finding failure decade after decade in physical fitness programs. So once I shifted my question and shifted my decisions, then I was able to sustain exercise programs much more significantly. And when one came to an end, I would modify and move into another. My diet changed and has been changed for several years now. So the actions have all been sustainable and the results have been very positive for me. So again, it was if I want different results, it was digging down into the questions that were producing the negative results, changing the question, and that changed all the decisions, the actions, and produced sustainable results for me. Okay, so again, if you don't like the results you're getting, don't rush into action. Start reflecting on what are the questions that you're asking that are producing those results. And you'll often find that they're judger questions that can be shifted to more learner, open, and possibility questions that will produce different decisions, different actions, and different and better results.